Kathy Laws. I am semi-retired, but part of a group in southeastern Pennsylvania that's opening a peer respite. We have a property that we took the keys to in November, and we have a director and assistant director, and we've been interviewing for staff. We'd hope to have a soft open in December, but here it is December 14th, and it's going to be January by the time we have staff and go through training and everything. So, but it's moving along.
I'm Gene Larkin. I was involved with Soteria, original Soteria, diabasis, and the M&N program. And I'm just back in the fold again, trying to do what I can to help people out.
Well, I'm Michelle Coppinger. I live in the upper Midwest, and I worked in the mental health field for too long, and it corrupted me. And then the more I learned about it, the more I hated it and disagreed with it, and realized I don't even believe in the constructs I was working in. But it took me forever to see, and know the truth about it. But I'd like to see some alternatives and that are not harming people.
My name is Maria Kavoris, and I'm the Executive Director of Respite Services for People USA. So the Rose Houses. And we have 4 of our own Rose Houses. We're in New York, so we have one in Putnam County, one in Walden, New York, one in Glens Falls, and one in Hyde.
Nice.
We're a completely peer-run agency, so 100% of the staff consider themselves somebody with lived experience.
I'm Al Galves. I'm part of a group that's creating a Soteria house in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And included in that group are Gene Larkin, who's on the call here, and Susan Usante. Susan is our paid consultant. Gene has been helping us out. So we're planning on opening in the summer of 2023, and that depends on getting money from the legislature. The New Mexico legislature is meeting starting in January. They'll have a 60-day session. A bill will be introduced to provide $859,000 for the first year of operation, and we're hoping, got our fingers crossed, that it'll be passed by both the House and the Senate and signed by the governor, and then we're going to go ahead and do it.
Susan Musante. I opened a Soteria house, not myself, but with a group of people in Anchorage, Alaska, which is currently not open, but have also been involved in, I consider myself a strong ally to peer-run services and alternatives to forced treatment, advocate against any type of forced treatment. As somebody said, if it's forced, it's not really treatment. So I'm not really sure what to call it these days. I'm working with Al in New Mexico. I'm recently back in New Mexico, working with Al and his folks, who, by the way, are very passionate and a real working group. And things are really happening. I think it could happen.
For our experience as well. And to add to also what you were saying about resisting to become Medicaid funded or state connected, that's absolutely where we have been as well. For some of the same reasons, Medicaid obviously would create a disenfranchisement for people that do not have funding, do not have insurance. And so we don't do anything that is segregating to people, including insurance-based access to peer support and recovery-based support. So we are not an agency that accepts Medicaid or any other type of insurance. And then relative to our state, very similarly, there is confusion about what it is and what it isn't, and a desire to try to make it look like something else. And we have resisted that. We are in a position though right now where it's gotten so much publicity around the country, internationally, and around North Carolina, that other people are starting to ask questions, including a healthcare association that is very connected politically. And so we have, they asked us to partner with them to scale respites in our state and for them to be a liaison between some of the political governors, state representatives, and allow them to use their connections to help us interpret, if you will, for lack of a better word.
I know we talked about that we're in the process of licensing some of the houses. We're not going to stop taking people with insurance, and actually we're helping create the licensure to fit like what we need. So it will be licensed, but it will also allow for, like, instead of just the 5 to 7 days of respite, there will be like one bed available for like people that might not have housing to return to for like 28 days to like try to get them into housing or something like that. Like I said, we'll never stop. We're not going to stop taking people without insurance ever as an agency, but just the way things are, it's kind of, we have to adapt a little bit, and part of that. But it's good because we're helping write that licensure, because here, like, we created the model. So like we have also crisis stabilization center here. Like we help write that. Now we're opening a few more. So, and that goes hand in hand with our Rose houses. They work very well together, the crisis stabilization and stuff.
It's really hard with our Office of Mental Health because our definition of safety is so different. We're looking at emotional safety as well as physical safety, and the facilities that our state runs right now, I mean, they definitely don't offer emotional safety, but physical safety. I mean, this organization, the state office that, would like to regulate us, they do such a terrible job regulating the facilities they have. Like, their own employees beat up their guests or patients. Like, it's just, and they just think that's part of the cost of doing business.
We need that, Jean.
Yes, absolutely.
Vesper and I did the keynote. We did a joint keynote for alternatives this year, and in part, the theme was there can be no alternatives if there are no alternatives. Right. We have no argument that policing and carceral care and all of these things that we are doing to human beings in the name of treatment should stop if we don't have alternatives to shift it to. And there are folks on this call, including myself, that have taken the leap to create these alternatives that demonstrate that they work and that they frankly need to be scaled so that there is access to these things, so we don't have to default to police involvement and involuntary commitment and other variations of forced treatment. At the same time, I feel like I've whiplash because we have New York and Washington and California, and Oregon is following suit. So we have all of this rise of involuntary treatment. At the same time, we have, in my state, we just have a class action lawsuit that was filed about the incarceration of children in psychiatric treatment programs that are being abused. So the rampant abuse and sexual abuse and neglect and harm, the conditions of these institutional settings. And I just got off of a call yesterday. I'm doing a panel presentation, and it was somebody who is with a hospital group that talked about their emergency department hospital boarding is so significant there that they are using what's called a posy bed. I don't know if anybody's familiar with a posy bed, but a posy bed is a cage. They are keeping people in cages in the United States, in inpatient settings. And this is what we are continuing to push more of with these messages coming out of New York and California and all of these other things. So we have to create these alternatives.
Yeah, I was just wondering about, I realize the ideal is to not get entangled with the government constructs and all that, and all their licensing and statutes. Like, I get all that and why. But these respites keep coming up against sustainability and financial resources. So I'm just wondering, like, is there a model for a bunch of peers that got together and ran something, facilities and programs that were part of the state monster, and their licensing requirements and their safety measures that are built in, and their staff background studies? Is there a case where that existed, where it was just all peer run, but using the state models?
So if I can jump in and try and answer that, in Alaska, we had a Soteria house and a Choices. The Soteria house was not necessarily a peer-run model, although a lot of the people we hired self-identified as bringing a lived experience to the table. Choices was a peer-run organization that modeled itself as a clinic, but it was peer-run by a board of directors, not all but most staff. And it survived for quite a number of years. It's subsequently closed, but it was part of the system. But it was kind of like, you remember that old commercial, The Other White Meat? So you could go to the regular mental health center, or you could go to Choices and get the same services, although Choices relied more on relationship and psychosocial programming than the others, but we did have a psychiatrist. So I'm sure that's not the only one. That's one I'm just personally familiar with. And we were licensed. We were governed by the state in order to be able to get state funds and Medicaid. I don't know if that, I'm sure there's others who can answer that better than I just did, but that's one example. Also, I think Al's group really is hoping that the Soteria Las Cruces will be embraced by the system and then become an alternative, but an alternative within the system, so that when people come there, when they present, they have more than one choice. They can go to a Soteria house. So Al, if I misspoke, stop me now.
Exactly. Well, I'd like to hear from Maria too, because Maria, her organization gets a lot of money from the state. So apparently they're able to do it.
So we are 100% peer run agency, and we are growing like very, very quickly. So, and we are in the process of getting licensed, but like I said, we are part of this process and writing into what needs to happen. I think part of that is, it's one thing to talk about who we are and what we do, but it's another thing to actually see it. So we do invite people, politicians, other organizations, people to come see the Rose houses themselves so they can see it. I know this sounds weird, but we actually just had like a Chamber of Commerce breakfast, and we invited a lot of people to it, and they did a play. I know it sounds weird, but they did a play like of staff, because we are a peer run respite. They highlighted staff stories, guest stories from being like at the bottom to now, like my story was one that was highlighted. So like from being like where I was to now being an executive director of respite services, and like from somebody going to crisis stabilization first and what the experience would look like from that all the way to Rose House, and then, eventually working as a peer one day. And I thought it was like when the CEO was talking about it, I'm like, this is a little like, like we're going to eat breakfast and watch a play, but it was like so impactful. And from that moment, like, it helped us like a lot get, a lot of funding and have people really see, not just hear. Because it's one thing, like we can give PowerPoints, we can talk about it, but like until somebody actually sees it, like they don't know. So like when we have these people come and tour and stuff, like they see how, like it's a home, it's a house. it's not clinical at all. It's like if I walked into somebody's house, like there's music instruments, there's yoga, there's TV, like we're not searching bags, and they come in and they're like, I don't even need services and I want to come stay here, you know? So I think that was part of like the big part and like how we were able to kind of get licensed, but also make that licensing work for us, because we don't ever want to lose that like grassroots feel of our agency. But like as times are changing and, you know, being able to somewhat bill Medicaid, it will also help with like sustainability, like staffing. Now that I run 4 houses, like we've helped, like we just helped, I don't remember the name of the agency. We just helped open one in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I went down there and I did consulting for them, but like running 4 of them myself now, I was able to like tell them like what sort of staffing patterns they need, like ask for this from the get-go, because like our houses right now are operating off of very old budgets. Like it's a lot, it's mostly ran off of per diem staff, which I'm sure we all know running 24-hour facilities with per diem staff is like almost impossible, but you know, nobody wants to increase the funding. So like now that I've helped other people open some, of like ask for this from the beginning, like, and this is how you're going to get the buy-in for people, invite them to come see the house. And I think that's kind of how we've been able to do this and sustain these. So that's.
So Maria, I have a question. Do you get general funds from the state? Do you get an appropriation from the state for any of your facilities?
Yeah, it's like usually through OMH and stuff and the county, and we do have to do certain reports that they ask for the county, and they are asking like what we're spending our money on and stuff like that. So I couldn't tell you the specifics because I don't have like the budgets in front of me, but I can get that information.
One thing,
You know, the issue about state funding for me is it's really dependent upon the state that you live in. Being in Massachusetts is one of the better examples that I have seen of states funding these. Sorry, my dog is going to agree with me here in a minute. Of states funding peer and respites, but not doing it in a way where there is control over how they are operated and the entryway in from the state. There are other states where it is state funded, but they start looking more like a clinicalized version of a respite, which I'm not going to name any states and any organizations, but you can definitely see with state and Medicaid funding how it went from being a grassroots, everybody can have access, no clinical assessments are needed, it is not a clinical service in any way, shape, or form, to morphing into a systematized version of what a peer-run respite is. I think for every organization that operates a respite, you have to take into consideration where you live, what the opportunities and resources are, and frankly, what you're willing to compromise on. You know, we have been doing this for 18 years, and sustainability has not been an issue for us financially. We've continued to grow over 18 years, and we are very principled in where we accept funding to come from. I turn away funding more than I accept it, because for me, I do not want to lose the history of this movement, the essence of what true peer-to-peer support is, and to become another extension of systems that have been traumatizing people in the name of treatment, but it's called peer-run respite. If I do that, other states and MCOs and funding sources will look and say, well, they're doing that there. They're willing to have clinical assessments. They're willing to have referral only. They're willing to accept insurance and everything that goes along with insurance. I'm not willing to be that peer-run organization that is going to then influence what people understand peer-run organizations to be. I'm not going to judge anybody else that does, but everybody has to make a decision that is right for them. If I lived in a different state where in exchange for funding would not be silence, the expectation would not be silence, that we no longer are vocal disruptors of harmful systems, I would consider state funding. I'm not in a state like that, and so I won't.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we do need to name the states that are friendly for this, and maybe some hybrid states where you can, because the fact is we have survivors in every state and they have to work with the resources in their area.
How are you funded?
So variety of different sources. For our local programs, we are funded by our county, foundations, charitable giving, and a lot of contracts. So because we have a long history with a lot of outcomes associated with it, what we end up doing is attracting funding of people that want to do innovation, but they want to demonstrate outcomes. Traditional funders are not attracted to what we do. And it's not a good, for us, it's not a good alliance with traditional sources of funding. So we are always discerning when funding comes our way, whether it's a good fit, but it ends up being done in non-traditional ways. And every time funding is brought to us, there are non-negotiable things on our end that we say to people: if we're going to accept your funding, these are our conditions. And that's the truth about our respite. We set forth our conditions to accept the funding to start the first respite.
In Alaska, for Soteria House, we only took people who came there voluntarily. And in Alaska, like many states, we have what are called therapeutic courts through the Department of Corrections. And so basically people get an option, but it's not really an option, to follow their kind of course of what they would call therapy or therapeutic court. So we had a guy living at Soteria House who had a case before he came to us. He voluntarily came to us. He found us. We took him in. He was living there, and his court case finally came up. And in therapeutic courts, their end result was they said, "We're going to commit him to Soteria House." And I said, and he was already living there. Is this like, how do we define insanity, right? So I support you, Shireen, in what you're saying as well. And I just said, I'm so sorry, because if you commit him, he cannot live here. We do not accept committed people. Unfortunately, we will have to, I use their terms, discharge him from our house, and then he'll be homeless. And so they withdrew that condition. Well, that was a great risk, because he could have ended up not at our house. But we weren't going to compromise on that, because then they would have been, that would have changed the whole nature, because then they would have said he had to do this group and that, and that's not how we worked.
It reminds me of about 8 years ago, we started working with the court systems, with diversion courts. And I'll tell you, we really deliberated about whether we were going to work within court systems for a lot of obvious reasons. But our team members who had been court involved were the ones who said, no, we need this. We need there to be somebody at the table that is challenging the narrative around criminogenic thinking and creating alternatives to carceral care. And who better than those of us who have been involved in carceral care? But we had to really do a lot of education. And we, to this day, so we're 8-9 years into this, we are the one community resource that cannot be court ordered. So that was one of our conditions, is you cannot court order peer support, forensic peer support. Anything that we offer has got to be openly accessible to anybody that wants it, but it's attraction, not promotion. And they've agreed to that from day one. And the other condition is we're not a mole. We're not there to tell you somebody's deep, dark secrets and experiences so that you can then use that against them in the court process, right? So it's taken a lot of negotiation within the most restrictive type of system to make it friendly to peer-run alternatives. So we have found it helpful, Vicki. So we have both what's called crisis stabilization units here, and peer-run respites. I would be very concerned about using the word respite for a crisis residential or a crisis stabilization. I think right off the bat, you have a concern. that they're using a word that means something very different to describe something that it actually is not. And that is part of the confusion that happens between a clinical setting and a peer-run respite setting. In a healthy community, there is multiple options available to people at different times in our lives for what we feel is needed. So I'm not going to say a crisis stabilization unit is wrong or bad, but I am going to say it's not the same. And depending on the person and where they're at and what's going on, a respite might be more in line with what they're wanting. We just had a meeting with our local crisis stabilization and something called a BHUC, which is a behavioral health urgent care, that when beyond 23 hours, they just release people. A respite is a longer opportunity to be here, but it also is a community because it's connected to a variety of peer-run options that does not have a time limit connected to it. That includes a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week warm line. So when somebody can go to a crisis stabilization for 23 hours with a peer-run organization, they can have a relationship and access multiple supports at different times that are self-directed. It literally costs us about $150 per person a day to run a respite. An inpatient stay in our state is $2,500 a day on average. A crisis stabilization unit ends up being like $1,300.
Well, I think also when you're showing people how important respites are, like at the end of the day, like respites save Medicaid money, a lot of money. And that's something,
The 24-hour crisis response type program, the 23-hour ones. Where's the person supposed to go at the end of 23 hours?
sorry, we have a crisis stabilization. So the goal is that you're not just like after 23 hours and 59 minutes, you're just like, okay, go back to, like, the goal is within that 23 hours and 59 minutes to link them to some sort of other service, whatever that may be. That could be respite, that could be detox, whatever they need. That's the goal of it. So the goal, and like people end up staying there sometimes for longer, probably than 23. I think it's good for us because we do have like so many other programs, so that we do have the crisis stabilization and Rose House. Like, it's a great partnership, but crisis stabilization should also be making partners with all the other agencies. Like, for example, like we have Aster Services, which is a different agency, but that's children's services in our crisis stabilization center and stuff like that. So that's the goal. It's not just to like send them out, you know, and just, oh, well, your time's up, you got to go. The goal is to like get them somewhere within that 23 hours and 59 minutes.
This is part of the problem of our public system, is none of it, there are pockets of outcome-based measurement of these things, but they are, for the most part, outputs-based, right? So they're not measuring the impact around quality of life, around recovery and empowerment and belief in recovery and hope. They're not measuring those things at all. They're simply talking about the number of people served in a crisis stabilization unit. If you're linking them to a service, right? So it's a very service-focused, service-biased system. Linking somebody to another service is considered a positive outcome as a crisis stabilization unit. It has nothing to do with people. You can't demonstrate quality of life outcomes in 23 hours. So these were not designed on the people side. They were designed for quick access to something, but they were not designed to support somebody to work on their healing from their trauma and to imagine a life that is not rooted in illness and pathology. So no, they're not. There's not outcome measurements for most of the services that are funded in the public system. When 988 rolled out, it rolled out with a good intention and framework. People need somebody to call, somebody to respond, and some place to go. Here's the rub. There's a fourth part of it that doesn't exist. And that is you went from somebody to respond to someplace to go. Why are we not saying support in your own community to stay in your home? Right. So there's that. And then the second piece of it is the somebody to call is a clinically based call center that does risk assessments and determine whether you need to be hospitalized or mobile crisis needs to come out. The somebody to respond is a mobile crisis team, which is clinical, that will do a risk assessment to determine if you need to be placed, whether it's a CSU or a hospital. And a place to go is a clinically based crisis stabilization unit, which takes involuntary commitments. So you are dropping people off against their will in a locked space. Not all of them, but many of them are locked space and they take involuntary commitments. None of that equation included alternatives. Somebody that you can call could be a peer and warm line. It doesn't have to be clinical. Somebody to respond could be people with lived experience that are making that connection with you in your community. And someplace to go could be a peer run respite. That isn't even that was never on the radar of the plan. And so it is short-sighted. So we are now, what we're seeing happening around the country is now the grow up of the crisis stabilization units and the living remodels and the call centers and the mobile crisis teams that are number one clinical that might hire peers as well. So part of it is that we're pushing against a paradigm that was created and bought and sold and policy that followed suit that was never inclusive of peer run alternatives.
Yeah, well, what we're doing is important. It's very important. And it's a very small movement compared to the mainstream system. I mean, just look at Soteria, right? Soteria is wonderful. And in 1983, well, from between 1971 and 1983, a very good research study was done, which showed that Soteria, people treated at Soteria were doing better in terms of social functioning, employment, rehospitalization, symptoms. A very good study. What they do, they shut it down. The NIMH shut it down. They fired the guy that started it. And that's, if you want to know where we are, that's been going on for the last 40 years. You have one Soteria in the United States. How much money do you think Medicaid is spending on drugs, on medication, on involuntary treatment, on hospitals? Billions of dollars. Yeah. But what we're doing is important, but you know, it's a rear guard movement, and it's very important, and we need to keep doing it. But let's be honest. I mean, you're fighting up against you're up against a juggernaut.
Well, but also in perspective makes a huge difference of what you're addressing. Literally, when Soteria was there, as far as I know, there was that, and there was a place in Connecticut, and that was pretty much it in the entire country. And so when I came back into this a couple of years ago, I was astounded at how much there was. So what you see is very small, I see is massive compared to what we were dealing with then. So it's all in perspective, and you just keep on plugging. I mean, go back to Martin Luther, keep your eye on the prize and just keep moving forward.
The adaptations are made to make it feel usable and accessible and valid in our local communities. The thing that does not change are the values. And this is what I'm continuing to work on with other peer run organizations. When we start to stray in our values to become something different for funding, that is when we've lost it. If we adapt to the environment, the way that we're structured or set up or something like that, but it's still values rooted and we are using those values to guide every decision, then absolutely the adaptations make sense. It's when we start to stray a little bit from, where we started from and try to convolute it to make it make sense in a current system, but call it something that is, embedded in the historical roots. That's where I get really concerned.